The mansion stood tall and glowing under the soft lights of the evening. Workers and assistants moved quickly through the wide halls, each of them busy with their own duties. For them, it was just another day of serving the billionaire who owned the house. He had recently returned from the hospital after undergoing surgery. Everyone believed he was doing well because the doctors said so, and because no one wanted to think otherwise. After all, the man was powerful, wealthy, and surrounded by the best professionals money could buy. Who would dare question the comfort of a man like him? Among the people in the house was a maid named Grace. She was quiet, humble, and hard-working. Every morning, she moved through the rooms with calm footsteps, cleaning surfaces, folding clothes, and making sure everything looked spotless. She had been working in the mansion for months, long enough to know every corner, every routine, and every face that passed by. Yet, despite being present in almost every room, she was almost invisible to everyone around her. The assistants hardly looked at her, the doctors never asked her opinion, and the family treated her as though she were part of the furniture. But Grace was more than what they saw. She had a sharp mind, patient eyes, and a heart that noticed small details others ignored. While the staff and visitors talked loudly about business deals or made jokes in the hall, she quietly observed. And lately, her attention had been drawn to the billionaire himself. He was known for his strength and energy. Even after long meetings, he had a habit of walking around the garden, enjoying the breeze, and planning his next project. But since his surgery, Grace noticed he no longer walked as much. He moved slower, sat longer, and his expressions carried something different, something like discomfort. His smile seemed forced, his laughter cut short, and his hand sometimes trembled when he lifted a glass. None of this was obvious to those who spent only minutes around him. But Grace was there every hour, moving silently in the background, and her eyes caught what others missed. She remembered the first time she saw it clearly. She was dusting the shelves near the library while he sat at the table. He reached for a pen, and it slipped from his fingers. He quickly covered the mistake with a laugh, pretending it was nothing. His assistant chuckled with him and continued reading the schedule aloud, not paying attention to the detail. But Grace noticed the stiffness in his hand and the wince on his face when he bent down to pick up the pen. She kept working, but her mind did not let go of the image. From then on, she began to see more signs. At dinner, he sometimes pushed his plate away after only a few bites, complaining of feeling full, though she could see the way he rubbed his chest quietly under the table. During mornings, his breathing seemed heavier, and once, while carrying a tray, Grace noticed sweat forming on his forehead though the room was cool. These were not the signs of a man recovering comfortably. These were signals that something was wrong. Grace wanted to speak, but she knew her place. In the mansion, her words carried no weight. The doctors came in and out confidently, carrying their medical files, assuring the family that recovery was on track. The assistants repeated those words like truth written in stone. And the billionaire himself, proud and unwilling to show weakness, brushed off any concern. Grace could already imagine the reaction if she tried to say something, a dismissive wave, a cold stare, or even laughter at the thought of a maid questioning medical professionals. Still, her heart did not let her rest. She cared, not because he was wealthy or powerful, but because she saw a human being in pain. She had grown up watching her mother take care of sick neighbors, helping them with small remedies when doctors were far away. She had learned to pay attention to body language, to small changes in a person's face, or the sound of their breathing. That instinct, sharpened since childhood, now told her something was deeply wrong. One afternoon, she was polishing the silverware when she overheard a conversation. One assistant laughed and said, "The boss has been skipping meals again, but maybe it will help him lose some weight." Another replied, "Yes, but the doctors said everything is normal. He just needs time." Grace bit her lip, her hands tightening around the cloth. They were joking, but she could not find it funny. She had seen the pale shade of his skin, the way his eyes sometimes clouded with pain, and the stiffness in his shoulders. These were not things to laugh about. Later that evening, as she carried fresh linen to his room, she found him sitting alone, staring at the window. He looked tired, more than usual, and for a brief second their eyes met. Grace wanted to ask, "Are you all right, sir?" but the words stayed trapped in her throat. Instead, she placed the linen quietly and left the room, her chest heavy with worry. Days passed, and the pattern grew clearer. The billionaire was pretending to be fine, and everyone else was choosing to believe it. Grace was the only one watching closely. She began to write small notes to herself, almost like a private record: less food today. Difficulty standing. Sweating again in the morning. The notes filled a small notebook she kept hidden in her apron pocket. It was her way of reminding herself that she was not imagining things, that her eyes and instincts were not lying. The mansion continued to buzz with activity. Visitors came, meetings were held, and laughter echoed through the wide halls. On the surface, everything seemed normal. But Grace could not shake the feeling that the man they all depended on was quietly fighting a battle no one else wanted to see. She watched him closely, not out of curiosity, but because she felt an unspoken responsibility. If no one else would pay attention, then she must. Each night, as she returned to her small room in the servants' quarters, she prayed softly. She asked for strength, for courage, and for a chance to make a difference. She did not know what the future held, but deep inside, she felt that a moment would come when her quiet observations might matter more than anyone could imagine. And so, as the days passed, Grace remained the silent guardian of truths unseen. She continued to sweep the floors, polish the silver, and carry trays as though nothing was unusual. But behind her calm movements was a heart that carried a growing worry, and eyes that refused to look away from the signs everyone else had chosen to ignore. The mornings in the mansion always began with soft noises. The cooks started working in the kitchen, the gardeners trimmed the hedges outside, and assistants hurried through the halls with schedules and reminders. To most people, it felt like a normal, organized routine. But to Grace, who noticed small details others missed, every morning revealed something new about the billionaire's slow decline. She carried breakfast trays into his dining room. The plates were filled with rich meals prepared by skilled chefs, but he hardly touched them. He pushed the food around with his fork, sighed, and sometimes drank only water or tea. When the assistants saw this, they nodded politely and said, "His appetite will return in time. Surgery does that to people." They said it with such confidence that no one questioned it. But Grace did. She noticed the slight grimace on his face whenever he swallowed, the way his hand pressed lightly against his side as if hiding the pain, and the cold sweat that sometimes appeared on his forehead even in the cool room. It was not just about food. She also saw how his energy faded quickly. A short walk across the hall left him breathing heavily. Once, while trying to sign a contract, he paused halfway, set the pen down, and rubbed his temples as though the effort drained him. The assistant nearby laughed it off and said, "Sir, maybe you just need more rest." The billionaire forced a smile, but Grace could see the frustration in his eyes. He was a man used to power, speed, and control. Now, weakness had become his shadow, and no one wanted to admit it. Grace tried to hint at what she saw. One day, she carefully mentioned it to the head assistant while placing flowers in a vase. She softly said, "I think Sir is not eating well. Maybe someone should check on him more closely." The assistant barely looked at her and replied, "The doctors already know. It is part of recovery. Don't worry about things you don't understand." The words stung. It was not the first time she was dismissed, and she knew it would not be the last. Still, her heart would not let her stay silent inside. She carried her quiet worries back to her small notebook, writing again, "No appetite. Breathing heavy. Pain in his eyes." The pages were filling quickly, and each note deepened her unease. She felt like she was holding a secret no one wanted to hear. One afternoon, she walked past the living room where a group of visitors were laughing loudly. The billionaire sat among them, his face pale under the golden lights. He smiled and nodded when they spoke, but every few minutes, his hand gripped the arm of the chair tightly, almost as if anchoring himself against dizziness. No one noticed. They were too busy with their conversations, too charmed by the idea of sitting with a man of wealth and power. Grace, standing quietly near the doorway with a tray, felt her chest tighten. She could see the man's strength slipping away little by little, hidden behind his pride and the blindness of those around him. That evening, as she cleared the dishes, she found one of his napkins damp with sweat and spotted with tiny drops of blood from his lips. Her hands froze. She stared at it, her heart racing. She wanted to show it to someone, to tell them this was not normal. But then she thought of the way they had laughed at her before, how quickly they dismissed her words. Slowly, she folded the napkin and placed it aside, her eyes filling with worry. The next day brought no relief. The billionaire stayed in bed longer than usual. When Grace entered the room with clean linen, she found him lying still, staring at the ceiling. He barely moved his head when she entered. She wanted to speak, to ask how he was feeling, but the nurse walked in behind her, smiling and saying, "Sir, your vitals look fine. You'll be walking around in no time." Grace wanted to argue, but the nurse's confident tone silenced her. She quietly placed the linen and left, but her mind screamed that something was wrong. Later that week, while watering plants near his study, Grace overheard two assistants talking. One said, "He seems weaker these days." The other replied quickly, "Don't say that. He hates weakness. He wants everyone to believe he's still in control. Just follow the doctor's words." Grace closed her eyes as she listened. They had noticed something too, but they chose to ignore it, to bury the truth under pride and obedience. That night, Grace sat by the window of her small room, staring at the stars. She thought about her mother's words when she was young, "Never ignore what your eyes see and your heart feels. Even if others laugh, truth never lies." Those words echoed in her mind now. She could not shake the image of the billionaire's pale face, his trembling hand, his silent suffering. She knew deep down that he needed more than rest and pride. He needed someone to truly see him. But what could she do? She was only a maid, invisible in the world of power. The doctors had degrees, the assistants had authority, and she had none of it. Yet, she also had something they lacked: patience, closeness, and the ability to notice small truths. She felt torn between fear and duty. Fear told her to stay silent, to protect her job, to keep her place. Duty told her that silence could cost a life. The conflict grew heavier with each passing day. She noticed the billionaire's steps becoming shorter, his appetite shrinking further, his nights restless with quiet groans that echoed through the halls. Sometimes she stood outside his door, holding a tray, listening to those sounds with tears in her eyes. She prayed quietly, asking for strength to know what to do. The rest of the household continued as though nothing was wrong. Business meetings were scheduled, parties were planned, and every assistant repeated the same phrase, "He is recovering well." Grace, holding her notebook filled with observations, felt like she was carrying a truth that no one dared to face. Her heart ached every time she saw him force a smile, every time he tried to sit straight in front of visitors while his body begged for rest. She saw the pride in his eyes, but she also saw the pain hidden behind it. And she knew, with growing certainty, that pretending everything was fine would only lead to something worse. She was not sure how, but she felt that a day was coming soon when she would have to choose between silence and courage. For now, all she could do was watch, wait, and pray that her eyes had not seen too much, even as her heart told her that the real storm was still ahead. The mansion looked quiet that evening, but inside the air was heavy with unease. Grace carried a tray of warm soup toward the billionaire's room, her footsteps soft against the polished floor. She had been growing more worried each day, and tonight, her heart beat faster than usual. When she opened the door, she saw him sitting upright in bed, his face pale and damp with sweat. The television played softly in the background, but his eyes were distant, unfocused. She placed the tray gently on the table and glanced at him. His breathing was shallow, and his lips looked dry. For a moment, she hesitated. She wanted to ask him directly if he was all right, but before she could speak, one of the assistants entered. The man smiled as if nothing was wrong and said cheerfully, "Sir, you're doing great. The doctor said you're on track." The billionaire gave a small nod, but Grace noticed his hand gripping the blanket tightly, as if he was holding back pain. When the assistant left, Grace remained in the room for a few seconds longer, pretending to adjust the curtains. She heard the quiet groan that escaped his lips when he thought no one was listening. It made her chest ache. He was suffering, and yet no one wanted to admit it. Later that night, Grace could not sleep. She sat on her small bed, her notebook open in her lap. She turned the pages filled with her careful notes, skipping meals, trembling hands, heavy breathing, sweating at rest. Each detail stared back at her, forming a clear picture of decline. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "Something is wrong. Something serious." The next morning, the situation grew worse. As Grace entered the dining room with a fresh jug of water, she saw the billionaire attempting to stand up from his chair. His body shook slightly, and before he could steady himself, his knees buckled. Two assistants rushed forward to help him sit back down. They laughed nervously and said, "It's only weakness from the surgery. He'll be fine." But Grace saw the panic in his eyes. For a brief second, their eyes met, and she felt that he knew too his body was betraying him. The rest of the day, she kept her eyes and ears open. The doctor visited in the afternoon, checking his pulse and blood pressure quickly before leaving with a confident smile. "Everything is normal," the doctor assured the family. Grace stood in the hallway, listening, her fists clenched at her sides. She wanted to shout, "No, it's not normal." But fear of being silenced kept her quiet. That evening, she brought fresh sheets to his room. The billionaire was half asleep, breathing unevenly. The lamp on the bedside table cast a dim glow on his face, making him look weaker than ever. Grace carefully changed the sheets, her eyes never leaving him. As she tucked the corners of the bed, she noticed his skin was unusually cold and clammy. She whispered softly, though she knew he might not hear, "Please don't give up." The turning point came a few nights later. Grace was polishing the silverware in the kitchen when she heard hurried footsteps upstairs. An assistant rushed past, looking anxious, muttering, "He doesn't look good." Grace quickly set down the silver and followed quietly, her heart racing. When she reached the door of his room, she saw him sitting on the edge of the bed, hunched over, his hand pressed to his side. His face was pale, his breath shallow and uneven. The assistants in the room looked at one another nervously, but none of them acted. One of them said, "It's just exhaustion. He'll be fine after some rest." Another nodded quickly, as if agreeing would make it true. Grace stood at the doorway, her hands trembling. She could not believe what she was seeing. They were ignoring the danger right in front of them. Her heart pounded in her ears. She took a step forward, clutching the notebook hidden in her apron. For weeks, she had written down everything she noticed, and now those notes burned in her pocket like proof of the truth. She wanted to speak, but fear caught her voice. What if they laughed at her again? What if they told her to leave? What if she lost her job? But then she saw him sway, his eyes rolling back for a moment before he caught himself. That sight broke her silence. She rushed into the room, her voice trembling but strong, "He needs help now. Something is wrong. Can't you see it?" The assistants stared at her in shock. One frowned and said sharply, "Grace, this is not your place." But she refused to step back. Her voice rose with urgency. "Please, listen to me. His condition is not normal. He's getting worse every day. If you don't act now, it might be too late. The room fell silent. The billionaire looked at her weakly, his lips parting as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. For a moment, Grace thought she saw gratitude in his eyes, or perhaps relief that someone finally spoke the truth. The assistants exchanged uneasy glances. One of them muttered, "The doctor said," but Grace cut him off. "The doctor comes for minutes. I see him every day. I've watched him struggle to eat, to breathe, to walk. His body is telling us something is wrong. Please, call someone now." The assistants hesitated, caught between pride and fear. They did not want to admit the maid might be right. But before they could argue further, the billionaire groaned and leaned heavily against the bedpost. His skin looked ashen, his chest rising and falling unevenly. That was the moment the denial in the room cracked. One assistant quickly pulled out a phone and called for medical help, his voice shaking. Grace stepped closer to the billionaire, her eyes filled with concern. She whispered, "Hold on, sir. Help is coming." Her hands shook, but her resolve was steady. Minutes felt like hours before a new specialist arrived, someone outside the usual circle of doctors. Grace stood back, her heart pounding, as the specialist examined him carefully. The man's expression grew serious, and he said firmly, "This is not normal recovery. He has serious post-surgery complications. If we had waited longer, it could have been fatal." The words hit the room like thunder. The assistants looked stunned, their faces pale with guilt. Grace closed her eyes, a silent tear sliding down her cheek. She had been right all along, and it had taken so long for anyone to believe her. The billionaire was quickly prepared for immediate treatment, his condition monitored closely. As the medical team worked, Grace stood quietly in the corner, her heart heavy but also filled with relief. She had finally broken her silence. She had risked everything, but in that moment, it no longer mattered. What mattered was that she had spoken when no one else would, and because of that, he had a chance to live. That night, as she returned to her small room, Grace sat on her bed and whispered a prayer of thanks. She knew the days ahead would not be easy, but she also knew she had done what was right. She had chosen courage over fear, truth over silence. And though the mansion was still filled with pride and wealth, she understood something none of them had grasped: life is fragile, and sometimes it takes the eyes of someone invisible to truly see it. The night of the emergency stayed heavy in Grace's mind long after the doctors left. The mansion, usually full of laughter and noise, had gone quiet, almost fearful. The assistants whispered among themselves, shaken by the specialist's words. For the first time, they had no easy explanation, no confident line about normal recovery. The truth was standing in front of them, undeniable and frightening. Grace sat quietly in the corner of the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Her heart was still racing from everything that had happened. She thought of the billionaire lying upstairs, his body weak but now under the right care. The image of him swaying in pain, almost collapsing, replayed again and again in her mind. She shivered at the thought of what might have happened if she had stayed silent. The next morning, the mansion was filled with activity. A new team of doctors and nurses had been brought in, and they moved with a seriousness that had been missing before. They checked his vitals, ran tests, and spoke in low, urgent tones. Grace passed by the room with her cleaning cart, her eyes catching glimpses of wires, machines, and medicine bottles. She felt a mix of worry and relief. Worry, because his condition was clearly worse than anyone had admitted, and relief, because finally, someone was paying attention. Still, not everyone was pleased. Some of the assistants avoided looking at her, their faces tight with pride. One of them even muttered under his breath, "She should have stayed quiet. It wasn't her place." Grace heard the words, but she kept her head down and continued her work. Inside, though, she reminded herself that it did not matter what they thought. What mattered was that the man upstairs had a chance to survive because she had spoken up. Later that afternoon, she was called to bring fresh towels to his room. Her steps were slow as she entered, her eyes landing on the billionaire lying on the bed. He looked tired, his eyes half closed, but there was something different in his expression. For the first time, he looked at her not as a background figure, but with a faint acknowledgement, as if he understood she had done something important. She placed the towels gently by the bedside and whispered, "Rest well, sir." His lips moved slightly, and though his voice was weak, she thought she heard him say, "Thank you." Those two words filled her heart with warmth. They were soft, almost hidden, but they carried more weight than anything she had heard in weeks. It was the first crack in the wall of silence that had surrounded her since she began noticing his struggles. The following days were intense. The doctors confirmed that an infection had developed near the surgery site, spreading quietly through his body. It explained the fevers, the weakness, the pain. It was dangerous, but now that it was being treated, there was hope. The mansion's atmosphere shifted from denial to urgency. The assistants followed the doctor's instructions carefully, the family visited more often, and suddenly everyone seemed alert. Grace watched all of this quietly, feeling both proud and invisible at the same time. Proud, because she had helped reveal the truth. Invisible, because no one gave her credit aloud. At night, she returned to her small room and wrote in her notebook again. But now the notes were different. Instead of only observations of decline, she wrote about improvement too. Took some soup today. Less pain in his eyes. Sat up longer. Each line felt like a step toward safety. One evening, as she was carrying a tray of tea past the library, she overheard two assistants talking. One said, if she hadn't spoken, he might have been gone by now. The other replied quickly, yes, but let's not give her ideas. She's just a maid. The family doesn't need to know, she noticed before everyone else. Grace paused at the doorway, her heart heavy. Their words reminded her of the invisible barrier that still stood between her and the recognition of what she had done. But she told herself she didn't need their approval. She had not spoken up for praise. She had done it because her heart told her it was right. That truth was enough to give her peace. A few days later, the billionaire's condition showed signs of real improvement. His skin regained some color, his appetite returned little by little, and his voice grew stronger. Grace saw him sitting upright in bed, speaking softly with a nurse, and a wave of relief washed over her. She smiled quietly to herself, knowing that the worst had passed. That night, as she adjusted the flowers in his room, he looked at her and said in a faint but clear voice, "You saw what others didn't." Grace froze for a moment, then bowed her head humbly. "I just did what I could," she replied softly. He nodded, his eyes thoughtful. That short exchange meant more to her than any grand gesture. The days turned into weeks, and slowly the mansion regained its rhythm. But things were not quite the same. Grace noticed subtle changes. The assistants, though still proud, sometimes glanced at her with quiet respect. The doctors, when they passed her in the hall, no longer dismissed her presence. And the billionaire himself, though still recovering, always met her eyes with a look that carried silent acknowledgement. Grace continued her work as always, cleaning rooms, carrying trays, and folding clothes. But inside, she felt different. She felt stronger, braver. She had found her voice when it mattered most, and though it had not been easy, she knew she had made the right choice. One evening, as the sun set and the mansion's golden lights glowed against the darkening sky, Grace stood by the window in her small room. She thought about how close they had come to losing him, how close she had come to staying silent. She whispered softly to herself, "Sometimes courage is just speaking when no one else will." She knew the journey was not over. Recovery would take time, and the mansion would still carry its air of pride and hierarchy. But she also knew that in the quiet corners of the house, in the heart of the man who had almost slipped away, her voice had mattered. And that thought filled her with a quiet strength that no one could take away. The mansion slowly returned to life, but it was not the same as before. The echoes of laughter and chatter filled the halls again, but beneath it all there was a quiet awareness of how close they had come to losing everything. The billionaire, once proud and untouchable, was still recovering but stronger than he had been in weeks. His steps were steadier, his voice clearer, and his eyes no longer clouded with constant pain. The air around him felt different too, softer, as though he had shed a part of the pride that had kept him silent before. Grace continued with her duties as she always had. She polished the silver, arranged the flowers, and folded the clothes with her usual care. But inside her heart, she felt a shift. She was no longer just the invisible maid who worked quietly in the background. Something had changed the night she spoke up, something no one could erase. She had found her courage, and even though most of the household pretended nothing had happened, she knew her actions had made the difference between life and loss. The assistants still carried themselves with pride, but now when they passed her in the hall, they gave her small nods. They did not speak of what she had done, but their eyes carried a trace of acknowledgement. The doctors, too, seemed more careful, spending longer in the billionaire's room, paying attention to details they had once ignored. Grace noticed these changes quietly, never drawing attention to herself, but each one confirmed what she already knew: the truth had been revealed, and it had changed everyone. One afternoon, as she entered his study with a tray of tea, she found him sitting by the window, sunlight falling across his face. He looked healthier, the color returned to his skin, and his hands no longer trembled as they once had. He turned toward her and spoke softly, "Grace." Hearing her name on his lips startled her. He had never addressed her directly before. She paused, setting down the tray, and answered gently, "Yes, sir." He studied her for a moment before saying, "You saved me." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of truth. Grace lowered her eyes, her cheeks warming. "I only spoke what I saw," she replied. He shook his head slowly. "No one else saw it. Or perhaps they chose not to. But you refused to ignore it." For the first time, Grace felt truly seen. She bowed her head respectfully and whispered, "I couldn't stay silent." The billionaire gave a faint smile, one filled with gratitude. "And because of that, I am still here," he said quietly. Those words settled into her heart like a gift, more valuable than money or titles. News of his near miss did not spread beyond the walls of the mansion. The family and staff chose to keep it quiet, not wanting the outside world to see weakness. But inside, Grace's role had been forever changed. Though no grand announcement was made, her presence was different now. People no longer brushed past her as if she were invisible. They looked at her, listened when she spoke, and sometimes even asked small questions about details she noticed in the house. It was subtle, but it mattered. Days turned into weeks, and the billionaire grew stronger. He walked through the gardens again, this time at a slower pace, but with steady steps. Grace often watched from a distance as he paused to breathe the fresh air, his eyes softer than before, as if he had gained a new appreciation for the simple things. Sometimes he would catch her watching and give a small nod of acknowledgement, a silent thank you carried in his gaze. One evening, after the doctors had left and the mansion was quiet, the billionaire asked for Grace to bring him tea personally. She entered the room carefully, setting the tray on the table beside him. He looked at her with a seriousness that made her pause. "I used to believe strength meant ignoring weakness," he said slowly. "But I've learned that true strength is listening when others try to help. You taught me that." Grace's eyes filled with emotion, but she kept her composure, bowing her head slightly. He continued, "I owe you more than words. I cannot change how others treated you, but I want you to know that in this house, your voice will never be ignored again." Grace felt her heart swell. She had never expected recognition, never asked for it, but hearing it from him was like a light shining in a place that had long been dark. The following days brought small but meaningful changes. Grace was given more responsibility, trusted with tasks beyond cleaning. She was asked to help manage schedules, to notice details others might miss. It was not a dramatic rise in status, but it was respect, and that meant everything. Despite the quiet recognition, Grace remained humble. She did not boast about what she had done. She continued her work with the same dedication as before, knowing that true worth was not in titles or applause but in the courage to do what was right, even when no one else would. The mansion once again glowed with its old rhythm of wealth and business, but beneath it all, a silent story lived within its walls. The story of how a quiet maid, overlooked and underestimated, had saved the life of the man who owned it all. It was a story known only to those inside, but it was one that changed the way they looked at her forever. Grace often thought back to the moment she had chosen to speak, the fear that had clutched her chest, the risk she had taken. It would have been easier to stay silent, to let others continue believing everything was fine. But she had not, and that choice had made all the difference. One night, as she lay in her small room, listening to the gentle hum of the mansion settling into sleep, she whispered a prayer of gratitude. Gratitude for the courage she had found, for the life that had been saved, and for the lesson that had become part of her own heart. Sometimes the smallest voice carries the greatest power. And though she remained in the shadows of the grand house, Grace knew she would never again doubt the strength of her own voice. For she had seen firsthand how it could cut through silence, change lives, and even save one.